And for more on some of these developments, we speak to Stephen Grootes, SAFM Sunrise anchor. Stephen, a very good evening to you. I think let's start with the Northwest list. How important is it, the fact that the list conference has been concluded, but they are not part of that list?
Good evening, Tapiso. Nice to talk to you. I mean, I think there's several things to say about the Northwest. As a general rule of thumb, the person who wins the registration process tends to win the conference. And I think that we're seeing that in the Northwest. That's why it took 12 hours. That's why it took so long. In terms of the national list conference, though, I don't think it will necessarily have had a big impact. It will have an impact in some ways. It also sends out the wrong kind of message, I suppose. The ANC is going to try and make this week about unity. The fact that one of the provinces, Northwest, particularly with the recent history around Supremo Homapelo, the premier who had to eventually sort of resign, although it looked like he didn't really want to, that doesn't help with that kind of image. And so it does have an impact in all sorts of different ways. And in a way is really a symptom or perhaps a consequence of the recent history of Northwest, which no one in the national ANC will really want to be reminded of at this time.
I mean, Stephen, there was a lot said about some of the names that made it onto the list, as you mentioned, that whole aspect of unity. But what can we read into some of the pronouncements made by the ANC and how it's going to whittle down some of those names in terms of ensuring those who are on the final list are in tandem with their values, their principles, and the kind of cadre that they're looking for?
You know, all of it is really a politicized process in a way, and you could be as objective as you like, but when you look at what the ANC is trying to do, it talks about integrity. I mean, I think it's impossible to really be 100% objective around that. There will be some people who are on the list who will have findings against them. So, for example, Badabile Dlamini, the leader of the ANC Women's League, minister in the presidency, there's a constitutional court finding against her, for example. Does that mean that she does not have the integrity? What about someone who, it appears, has lied in public? Mosebenzi Zwane, former Minister of Mineral Resources, he said in public that there would be an inquiry, an official inquiry into the banking system, when actually the president at the time, then Jacob Zuma, had to rebuke him for saying that and say that's actually not the case. So does that mean that he lacks integrity because he's lied in public? What about Malusi Gigaba? No findings against him that I'm aware of, and yet all sorts of, well, smoke and heat, shall I say. So it's going to be a very politicized process. I can't stress the importance of this for the ANC, though, because while the ANC is trying to sort of overcome the factions that led to what happened in 2017, in a way, some of those factions are still playing out, and the result of this list conference is the current terrain on which that battle is being fought.
And speaking of playing out, Stephen, there's the whole resurfacing of former President Jacob Zuma on the Twitter streets. What should we read into that? And the fact that he's made it onto the list, and the fact that this process has also been taking place in KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah, there are various things to say. I mean, I think former President Jacob Zuma was always going to make it onto the list. If I remember correctly, there were suggestions that Thabo Mbeki emerged on the list several years ago, and it was obvious he didn't have the interest of coming back into frontline politics. You know, this sort of thing happens. There's nothing unconstitutional about it in terms of the country's constitution, and so it wouldn't surprise me as someone who was so popular as to win the 2012 ANC conference is still popular enough to become sort of on a list at this time around, just a few years later, 6 years later. That said, I would be surprised if he went back to Parliament. I don't think he would really want to do it when he's not in charge anymore. I think he would find that frankly boring. In terms of his resurfacing on Twitter, well, this is fascinating because he's talking about land. He says, for example, that he believes land should be nationalized. He suggests that that's what European countries do. I think many people who come from European countries might disagree with that. They would suggest that that's actually not the case. But his policy position, to my mind at least, seem to be a lot closer to the EFF, which believes in the nationalization of land, rather than the ANC. Most of the people I've spoken to in the ANC, so I don't know if it's the same for you, they've spoken about land tenure, about actual ownership of land. In fact, Vali Musa several years ago went so far as to say that they wrote the actual language of Clause 25, the property clause in the Constitution, so that black people would never be dispossessed of their land again. So it was a very interesting comment by the former president, I thought. He seemed to be closer to the EFF than the ANC. ANC.
And Stephen, therein lies the rub, because does a candidate like President Jacob Zuma, is that in sync with the non-racialism policies that they're trying to push? Because there's certain sectors of society who'd argue that some of these policies are racially divisive. How does the ANC handle that?
Yeah, I think land by itself, the land issue, does not necessarily divisive along racial lines. It has huge potential to be, and probably would become so almost inevitably, but that doesn't mean that there's anything racist or racial about saying that there's a big problem with South Africa's land ownership patterns. You could easily argue, and I think it would almost be accepted by almost everybody, that the racialized inequality that we see around us, and is the lived experience of most South Africans, is because of what happened on the land 300 years ago and the events that followed. And we could go into a very long history about it. But I think, though, that the ANC, when it comes to issues around race, has got to manage this incredibly carefully. It's always wanted to be the party to all people. Now, that's always very difficult to do because of the huge divisions in our society, and I would argue those divisions have probably grown for various reasons over the last few years. So many of those reasons are economic. So what the ANC's got to try and do is try and show that it is not, and I'll use this as an oversimplification, that it is not anti-white. And there's several ways it can do that. One is that it can ensure that the land debate is properly handled. And there's been suggestions, if you hear President Cyril Ramaphosa talking about it from time to time, you can see he's almost extending olive branches. The Deputy President, David Mabuza, has gone to go and speak at farmers' conferences hosted by Agri-SA. Those are important. I think also, and sort of back to the list conference in a way, I suppose, the ANC has a chance with its lists to show that it is a party that is very diverse. The Democratic Alliance is going to try and claim during these elections as the most racially diverse party. The ANC is going to try and use this list process to show that the DA cannot make that claim.
And I'm wondering that, Stephen, what kind of attractive means is the ANC going to try and use when they launch their manifesto at the January 8th event? Because the other political parties, as you've mentioned, they've tried to use some of those characteristics which make them look like not only are they outdated as a liberation movement, but the fact that they're corrupt, that they don't embrace all South Africans as they claim to do. What kind of stops are they going to pull out?
Yeah, no, I think there's several things. Firstly, I think they'll try and appeal to the sort of earlier track record of the ANC's time in power. So the Mandela years, the Thabo Mbeki years, they'll talk about the economic growth during that time. They'll talk about the improvements in the education system, the recent improvements in the matric results. They will talk also about electrification, although they might want to tread a little carefully there if there's load shedding leading up to the elections. What they will also talk about is hope. And they will suggest, and you'll have to excuse the thunder in the background in Gauteng at the moment. But what I'm sure that they will try and do is that they will talk about specifically what can be done, and they will make the claim that only the ANC can do it. They will also talk about a renewed ANC, and the ANC has done this before with some success. If you recall, in the Mbeki era and during what was called the sort of AIDS denialism, he would dispute that, of course. But the ANC was able to campaign quite successfully in 2009, almost against some aspects of its own track record. And I think the ANC under Ramaphosa is going to try and do the same thing here. It's been successful in the past. It may well be successful again.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. Stephen Grootes is SAFM Sunrise anchor, just unpacking some of those issues around the ANC's list conference and the issues that they're grappling with. Now, traffic